Dr. Adam Busiakiewicz is an art historian who has taken the Tudor world by storm in the past couple of weeks, thanks to his discovery of a portrait of King Henry VIII that was thought to be long lost. Like most big discoveries, it was hiding in plain sight all along. The piece is part of a 22 portrait set by Ralph Sheldon and was painted during the reign of Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Adam joins me today to discuss how he found the portrait, details about its origins, details within the portrait itself, and much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 51, Henry VIII by Ralph Sheldon, a portrait rediscovery by Dr. Adam Busiakiewicz. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Dr. Adam Busiakiewicz. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much for inviting me, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're here today to talk about a fabulous discovery that you've made of a portrait of King Henry VIII that has been missing for some time. But before we get into that conversation, I just wondered if you could provide a short intro into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full-time.
Indeed. Well, as you just mentioned, my name is Adam Busiakiewicz. I am an art historian based just on the edge of London these days, but I'm a Warwickshire lad originally. My hometown is Stratford-upon-Avon. I share that hometown with, of course, the more famous William Shakespeare, although I'm a terrible poet or sonneteer, not a shade on him. But I had the great luck as a youngster to grow up also in Vienna, where I spent 6 years of my life. I later came back and studied once again at high school and sixth form here in England. My first degree was actually in history, so history has always been such an integral part of my life, my interests. And as soon as I finished that degree, I was very lucky enough to get a job at a place called Warwick Castle, which is a magnificent place, very evocative, not only for medieval history, but had also, the remains of a fantastic collection of paintings, furniture, and arms and armour, which really sort of sparked my imagination about studying history through objects. And so after working there, I fortunately enough got a scholarship to do a master's degree at the Sotheby's Institute, where I studied for a year and a half or so, and then basically never looked back since. I absolutely love it when you can, take an object, be it a painting, be it a helmet, be it a musical instrument, and sort of work out its history from there. And only recently, I should say, a year or two ago, finished my doctorate in art history at the University of Warwick, studying, in fact, a topic related to the Earls and Countesses of Warwick. So studying history through art is what really does excite me the most.
I adore Warwick Castle. I think it's it's, to your point, it's so sort of evocative. And it's also, unlike a lot of other castles, it's still so rich in detail, and the fact that you can see so much of it, and the history is so rich at Warwick Castle. So was there a particular moment that you can sort of, that you recall maybe from your childhood that sparked your passion for Tudor art and Tudor art history in particular?
Gosh, well, I suppose the topic of history in general, probably because of my grandparents, who were Polish refugees who came here after the war. I had many very inspiring grandparents who always made me think about the past in a way that felt very tangible. And I suppose when I got to A levels, really, it was that moment where I thought, it's the study of history that I want to do if I can for the rest of my life. We, of course, in sixth form, we did the Tudor rebellions, which I suppose many history A-level students do, and also things like Peter the Great and the Dutch Revolt, which sparked off fascinations elsewhere. But it was really, I suppose, working at Warwick Castle, which, again, as I mentioned, has this historic collection of paintings as well as everything else that comes along with that place. And it was, I suppose, looking at the paintings there are some very fascinating and beautiful ones. They actually owned, up until 2015, one of the greatest I suppose, workshop of Holbein portraits of King Henry VIII, which unfortunately was later sold by them. But when I think one of the reasons that we're continually drawn to portraits and paintings in general, particularly Tudor ones, is because they're not only, fascinating from understanding biographies, and you're there with the face of the person that you've studied and you're fascinated with, but also they're intrinsically beautiful. Read any book by Roy Strong on the subject, and you just are drawn in, literally sucked into this world of iconography, symbolism, and all of these strange aspects of the Elizabethan and Tudor world, which feel so foreign to us today because, we're hundreds of years later, but they spoke in visual terms using a completely different language that I think, is endlessly fascinating. You will never be able to sort of, completely grasp it all because I think, especially in the Tudor period, they were so well educated, and it's that mystery that keeps us going. But so I suppose it was working at Warwick really that really started to make me look at these things differently.
And I think the other thing is that, particularly with Tudor portraiture as well, it's so advanced, and you're seeing, in particular, certain figures, you're seeing probably what they genuinely look like. Whereas when we look at the earlier sketches, portraits of the Plantagenet kings and queens, they're so, they're so rudimentary. And so for that reason, I think that's part of the reason also why the Tudor portraits just feel so much better, because we're looking at what look like people.
The sort of picture that breaks that rule, of course, is the coronation portrait of Richard II, which is in Westminster Abbey, which is, a period painting. But I suppose it's due to the Reformation and due to lots of other reasons that, so much medieval art was destroyed. But, again, look at the Wilton diptych, look at that painting of again, Richard II. And, imagine how many more evocative images there were of medieval kings and queens and, that have been lost to time. That's inevitable. I suppose with the Tudor period, it's because so much survives. And also you have these phenomenal artists with extraordinary talent, like Hans Holbein, of course, who captured these people in a way that is so timeless. And I'm sure you went to the King's Gallery exhibition of Holbein at the court of Henry VIII. Those drawings, despite being 500 years old, sort of still speak to the humanity of that court in a way that I think is more evocative than photographs sometimes do. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I actually think that the sketches I did go to the exhibition, and in many respects, often the sketches can be more evocative and look more lifelike sometimes than a finished, sort of fully rendered portrait. So if you could pick a single moment, I suppose, from history to go back and witness, what would it be?
Well, that's what a question it is. And I suppose being a historian and an art historian, and particularly since I work with Old Master Painting for Old Master Paintings department at Sotheby's, I have to admit that that my interests are broad, and there are certain moments in my life where I'm drawn to certain periods, and that sometimes might be the Elizabethan period, but it also might be I endlessly find the Napoleonic period these days, just absolutely engaging and fascinating, and the art that was produced from that period too also does something for my sort of my brain that other periods don't. I suppose if I was to look back at any period of history, I would love to see the court of Elizabeth I. I would love to see what one of those accession day tilts, those magnificent marvels of military exercise and spectacle and performance art, you might say, those jousts were. I mean, I would have loved to have seen what that was like. And although films, let's be honest, Hollywood do their best to evoke that sense of what a joust in that period was like, I think we just can't imagine what it was like. Day-long events filled with poetry, filled with a type of pageantry of a kind that we just don't have the patience for anymore. And not to mention all the magnificent artworks and armors that were made for it. To see those armors that are now, preserved at Greenwich or in the Tower of London or in Leeds, which were and then still are magnificent, don't get me wrong, but to see them in action and to see what it was like, I'd give anything to do so.
Do you have a Tudor pet peeve? I suppose in your case, a Tudor art pet peeve, maybe?
Again, it's a very interesting question, that. I I suppose I have really niche concerns sometimes. And let's be honest, we're continually, as historians, trying to, I suppose, do our best to correct errors regarding, mythologies around certain figures, or just, I suppose, misunderstandings of the past. I think one of my pet peeves is definitely when it comes to things like arms and armor, which I'm also incredibly passionate about. My master's dissertation was actually looking at armor and Van Dyck's portraits. But again, the amount of people that might look at armor and swords, edge weapons, and think it's just a practical thing, rather than understanding perhaps necessarily that these armors were incredibly customized, personalized, and incredibly symbolic in the way that they were used, particularly the Elizabethan ones, which are often so profusely decorated with gilding, with embossing. These are really works of art that should be understood as such and appreciated as such. When you go and look at Sir Christopher Hatton's armor in Windsor Castle, you see Elizabeth's coats of arms and the various forms of knotwork, which are deeply symbolic about what it was to be the Queen's champion at these tilt yards. And so I sometimes find it really tricky when people generally point out with all of these armors, and particularly Elizabethan ones, saying, well, it was just about showing off, boiling down everything to showing off or to wealth alone, and to misunderstanding, the wider context of these things is what does sometimes present itself as a peeve to me.
So, as I said, we're here today to discuss a portrait of Henry VIII by Ralph Sheldon that you rediscovered. And you rediscovered it, like most of these things, by sheer chance. So I'd like to start by asking you actually how you spotted this portrait that we're speaking about today.
Like many of us these days, I spend a lot of time on things like X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram, scrolling through, looking at things. And many people, of course, use that social media platform to look at cat videos and to look at very, fun and entertaining clips. But I use it to look at what's on people's walls. I think social media gives us this opportunity to walk into rooms that we will never go or never have the opportunity to. And it presents us with phenomenal examples and opportunities, really, to look at what is in specific spaces. That doesn't have to even just be necessarily in historic houses. It can be in private collections. It can be in museums. I'm always constantly looking at what people are posting, thinking, looking at the walls, thinking, what on earth is that? I want to know more. And so in this particular case, the Lord Lieutenant of Warwickshire, a man called Tim Cox, who I follow on Twitter, posted a gathering in Warwickshire Hall relating to one of his charitable events, which the Lord Lieutenancy is very much involved in. And I just spotted in the corner of the room a very distinctive arch-top painting, and in a very nice gilded frame. And my immediate thoughts were, wow, that's very interesting. And the reason it was interesting is because last year at Sotheby's, I worked and catalogued a archtop painting of Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, which belonged to this very famous set of 22 portraits, which Ralph Sheldon, the Warwickshire tapestry maker and local politician, commissioned in the 1590s. So this was an immediately sort of alarm bell ringing in my head. So I, went off, took about an hour to try and find other photographs of the painting, and to also look through the books to see whether this painting of Henry VIII, as it turned out, had ever been identified as being part of Sheldon's very famous set. And it took me an hour. I managed to even try and find a photograph of the painting on like a virtual tour of Shire Hall, because it's used mostly these days as a wedding venue and a venue for events. It's all of those paintings there are just for decoration, not for any historical purpose or laid out like a gallery, just purely for something on the wall. And I even spotted that the painting is in exactly the same frame as other surviving examples from the Sheldon set, including the Earl of Essex. So within an hour, I managed to work out that this was Sheldon's portrait of Henry VIII, and it seems it's been missing. Nobody in modern times has spotted it. And the last true study of Sheldon's set was made in 2015, so very recently, by a scholar called Catherine Daunt, who works, I believe, for the NPG now, in photographs or something like that. But she studied the whole set, listed exactly what's known about them, where they were, where they are, and this had never been found before. So it was a very exciting and strange opportunity.
So evidently you very quickly realised the provenance of the portrait and the part of the collection it was tied to. Do you have any sense on how long it had been missing for?
A very good question. Well, we know from a plaque on the painting, and I only saw the painting in person sort of like a week and a half later when I was invited to go and have a look at it on a stepladder, because they're hanging up incredibly high. You can't just look at it from the floor. It's just, it's just in a place where it just can't be admired whatsoever. And so on the plaque, on the painting, it says it was bought by the council in 1951 from a historic house called Madeleine Hall in Cambridgeshire, which is now owned by the University of Cambridge, actually. So we knew that it came from this historic house. And on the back of the painting, we also know that it was last sold in an auction at Christie's in London in 1908 from the Marchioness of Coiningham. But in those two examples of 20th century provenance, no mention is made of this being a Sheldon painting. It seems that its significance completely lost to time, just a copy after Holbein. And in fact, when the painting was catalogued for Art UK, the Public Collection Foundation, they described it actually as style of Holbein, which in art historical terms means that they thought it was obviously a later copy. Style of means 100, 200 years after, nothing to do with the 16th century or its true significance. And we know that Sheldon's set of paintings was last sold in 1781, and exactly what happened between 1781 and 1908 is still a mystery, unfortunately. So you might say that it's been missing from the Sheldon set since 1781, or you could also say, well, it was last sold in 1908, but it's certainly been a long time since its true significance was established.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I've just been reminded, when you were saying a moment ago about how you discovered the portrait. A few years ago, I was watching a documentary about Anne Boleyn, and during the documentary, in the background of one particular scene, I could see a portrait of Anne Boleyn that I had never, ever seen before. And despite trawling through Google Images, I just could not find this portrait. In the end, I managed to track down the documentary's producer via IMDb and then asked her where it was filmed, and then got in touch with the venue and they were able to send me a sort of a high-res copy of it. But it was a proper rabbit hole that I had to sort of go down to try and find a clear shot of this portrait, because Anne Boleyn portrait discoveries in particular are obviously extremely rare, and we're all hoping that a true portrait of Anne crops up. Part of me thought, could this be it? And sadly it wasn't. It was the later copy. But it's fascinating how sometimes those things in the background, which can be overlooked by many, if you know what you're looking for, can be quite exciting, which is exactly what's happened with you.
Exactly, yes. Films, television, particularly ones filmed in historic locations. I'm sure, like you, just constantly a person that's looking around these sets and thinking, firstly, where is it filmed? And usually it's somewhere like Hatfield or Wilton, particularly. Wilton's just everywhere, Bridgerton, just anything Wilton. But yes, it's terribly exciting, and well done for finding it in the end. Was it important or lost or not known about widely, or?
It was just a corridor portrait of Anne Boleyn, not particularly important, but very rare in the sense that it's very, very seldom seen. So that's why I was curious to see it, because also you could just tell from looking at it that it was quite old. It was by no means a sort of a modern portrait. But sadly, they weren't really able to tell me much more than that it wasn't contemporary and was just a later copy of a lost, potentially original. Who knows? So, can you just tell me a bit more about the Sheldon portrait set? I think it was 22 portraits were painted. Do we know the whereabouts of every single one of them?
Yes, there were 22 paintings as part of that set. And I suppose one of the reasons that the Sheldon set always sort of stands out from some of the other more famous sets, and as you've just mentioned, corridor sets were very popular in aristocratic and well-to-do households in the 16th and turn of the 17th centuries. But the Sheldon set is rather special because the paintings are actually quite good. including the Henry VIII. They're much bigger than the standard sort of bust length that you find for corridor sets. So they're bigger, they're imposing, and also I think the quality of them is actually rather good too. The Henry VIII, as soon as I've been able to very luckily see it off the wall now. They actually took it off the wall finally, so I didn't have to look at it on a step ladder, nearly trying not to break my neck. But the quality of it's incredibly good. Again, lots of these corridor sets can feel rather pedestrian and the details are lacking and not, it's just that sort of copy paste attitude to portraiture. But the Sheldon set, is very good indeed. So 22 paintings were made. The majority of them are still lost. So there are many more waiting out there. The most famous ones that survive include the portrait of Wolsey, which is in the MPG. And I find it fascinating that, that MPG Wolsey is probably one of the defining images of him because it's in that important collection and, it's on display. And, not many people know looking at it that it actually dates to, decades after Wolsey died. But I suppose that says something about the quality of the set, that it still sort of holds its own in a way. 2 paintings, including Henry VII and I think it's Henry VI, are at Eton College. I'm hoping to go and see them soon if I can. And 2 others are of medieval kings, including Henry V, are at Nebworth. I've only seen poor reproductions of them. We at Sotheby's last year sold the portrait of the Earl of Essex. A portrait of Edward VI was also on the market about over 10 years ago. So, and Richard III as well was formerly with Philip Mould. But actually, the majority of them are still missing. There are portraits of Prince Arthur, so Henry's younger brother, that survive. I will send you an engraving of it if you want. It was engraved in the 19th century, and it has the characteristic Sheldon arch top and inscription on it, and it's missing. So maybe one of your viewers / listeners will find it. But it's based on the Royal Collection prototype, which exists of him in the hat. There are also other figures, mostly foreign figures, Charles V, various French kings, etc., Elizabeth of York as well. So exactly where they've gone, we don't know, but they are still missing. So there's more discoveries to be made, yeah.
So in you wrote a couple of blog articles about the discovery of the painting, and you mentioned the Robert Devereux Earl of Essex one. Forgive me, but it sounded like you were saying that isn't actually part of the Sheldon set, but was based on a Sheldon version of the Earl. Can you clarify?
Yes, very fascinating. So there was a portrait of the Earl of Essex that formed part of the Sheldon set, which was sold by the Earl of Jersey at Sotheby's last summer. And Sotheby's have all the cataloguing online if you want to see it. It's very interesting because it's one of the few figures in that set that were actually living at the time that it was assembled. And if you're thinking, if it was assembled in the 1590s, well, then Essex was at sort of the height of his power, and this was just before Cadiz. And you might imagine that Sheldon would have wanted, the Queen's favourite in as part of that. And it's very interesting because the Essex portrait has always, since even before Sir Roy Strong's time, but also published by Sir Roy Strong, as being by William Seager. William Seager is a fascinating figure because he was, for a lot of the period, in fact, in the late 16th century, a very famous herald. He was the heraldic painter for the Queen. And he is famous for painting portraits, particularly of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex. And so this Essex portrait from the Sheldon set has been attributed for a long time to Seager. Now, the question is why would William Seager paint one of those paintings that was part of the set and not the others? And that's a really good question because it's still a bit of a mystery. I think it's entirely possible that William Seager was actually the artist in charge of them all. But when you actually compare them and you have them side by side, all the surviving ones at least, you can actually see that the quality of them actually varies.
Right.
I think Wolsey, for example, he looks a bit like a sausage in some aspects of his face and his hands. I think the portrait of Henry VIII actually is remarkably good. The face pattern, particularly, is really spot on, and some of the details of his jewelry and his costume are really finely done. And it doesn't quite match, the quality found in the Henry VII or the Henry V that's at Nebworth. And so it seems to us, at least art historically, that different hands were engaged in producing them, which is really confusing. But I think if you did say, and this is maybe something for the future, maybe the MPG are listening to this. Imagine getting the whole set or surviving set back together, doing a thorough study of them, really trying to work out, and you could do this with infrared technology. You can look through the paint layer and see how they were made, what cartoons were made, and let's stylistically compare them all and see what we find. Now, the Essex, I think, was by far the best quality image and the best quality painting or portrait, let's say, that was part of surviving paintings now. So I think it seems entirely plausible that that William Seeger painted it, and he was living. Essex was still alive, where the other guys weren't.
Yeah, maybe it was painted.
Well, a good question. We actually know that the Sheldon Essex was made using a cartoon. So we actually scanned it at Sotheby's with infrared, and you can see the pouncing mark. So that idea of getting a very thin piece of paper and sort of pricking it with a pin and rubbing charcoal through it so that you can make an impression on the panel that you're then painting. But it relates to William Seeger's portrait of Essex, a painting which is now in the MFA in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts. And the most amazing thing is when we were cataloguing at Sotheby's the Sheldon Essex, amazingly, the museum in Boston hadn't even photographed their painting of Essex by Seeger in modern times. They only had a black and white image of it. So it's amazing sometimes how neglected some of these paintings are, despite the fact of how important they are. And the Sheldon portrait of Essex showed him in armor. So, typical Essex with military ambitions, as we imagine. But the Boston painting shows him in this magnificent sash doublet, so showing him as a courtier. And so, again, I love that idea of maybe Seeger undoubtedly trying to portray this very ambitious Earl in two different modes.
As you say, the portraits date to the 1590s. So that's during the latter end of the reign of Elizabeth I. They were displayed at Weston House in Warwickshire. Do we know whether there's any chance that Elizabeth visited and would have therefore seen the set and therefore this portrait of her father?
That's a good question. There's a brilliant scholar called Hilary Turner, who has written the most, I suppose, in-depth articles on Ralph Sheldon, the Warwickshire tapestry maker and local politician who assembled this very famous set at Weston House, as you quite rightly point out. Sheldon was also a tapestry maker and had this magnificent set of maps of Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, and other counties he owned land in. So his house, Weston, for its day, was really, really quite something. And Hilary goes into the details of how much money was spent on it and what the rooms looked like. It was enormous. But as far as I can tell, no monarch ever visited it. But it must have been the ambition of Sheldon to actually, at some point or other, like most of these houses, well, like Kenilworth, which is only down the road, to host the Queen or the King at some point. He lived into the reign of James I. But I think with Sheldon, what's really fascinating that adds another layer to all of this is that Sheldon was a Catholic. And so Catherine Daunt, who wrote in 2015 on the Sheldon set, suggested that actually maybe Sheldon's motivation even behind the set was in some way a nod, let's say, to the legitimacy of Elizabeth I and the Tudor monarchy in general, but also the fact that he would have to do this because he was Catholic and these things were fairly contentious, although, again, the moderate feeling that existed at her court is also worth pointing out. But it doesn't seem like anybody did. But, later in the 18th century, for example, lots of famous art critics, including George Virtue and Sir Horace Walpole, actually went to go and see these paintings and wrote about them and made notes of who were in the set. So it was, even after Sheldon's lifetime, somewhere to go and visit and see.
You mention an engraving that was created in 1839 by Henry Shaw, and this engraving actually sort of helped to convince you that the portrait is indeed the missing Sheldon of Henry VIII. So can you describe the engraving, and can you figure out who else is depicted on it?
Yes, Shaw's engraving is something of a mystery because it depicts, and it's inscribed as such, as depicting the old Long Gallery at Weston House, which is an unrivaled opportunity, and Turner actually writes about this in her articles, an unrivaled opportunity to get an understanding of what this set looked like when it was displayed in the house. And you can see that the set of portraits was actually in a frieze, sort of fit into the top of the room. And again, they all conform to that curved and rounded arch shape, which is quite distinctive. Now, the question is if the set was largely sold off in 1781, how on earth did Shaw see the paintings in situ if that room was entirely dismantled, which we believe it to be? And so it's very clear that he must have been using some earlier source material for it. And you can actually identify some of the portraits quite clearly. So Wolsey is very identifiable. I also think Charles V is very identifiable. There is also quite identifiable portrait of Elizabeth York, for example. But Henry VIII is also undoubtedly the most identifiable one in there. And it's, as soon as I was looking at that engraving, I thought, isn't it crazy that, not only did Shaw get that detail of Henry in the hat, but also holding a sword, which is quite interesting in the iconography of Henry VIII. I'm sure you know the Holbein barber surgeon picture, which shows him holding a sword, the idea of justice. But actually in a corridor portrait format, Henry holding a sword is a very rare thing indeed. It's a very distinctive composition, let's say. And also the fact that his hands, you can quite clearly see in that engraving, are also included. So it's clear to me, at least, that all of this coincidental evidence can't be ignored. Shaw must have had some opportunity to study an earlier drawing of that engraving at Weston House. But again, it adds to our understanding of how that painting was originally perceived when Sheldon put it there in the 1590s.
Can you walk me through the portrait of Henry? I mean, it's clearly him in his later years. So do you know if it's based on perhaps an original Holbein?
Yes, it seems that the face type or face pattern, you might call it, is based on the Holbein mural, the one that was at Whitehall. Now, of course, that pattern, survived, and many later copies and paintings were made from it, including famously that full-length portrait, which is at Petworth House. Have you ever seen that in person?
Possibly. There's possibly. So many.
So many.
And they all look relatively similar, particularly that sort of face-forward stance. They all kind of look quite similar. So I've probably seen it, but...
Well, a terribly imposing image. They call it Workshop of Holbein, but I think it probably dates to just slightly after. I think, as we know, as you mentioned with paintings of Anne Boleyn, they just copied them out again and again and again. But the Sheldon painting, I think, is actually incredibly faithful to Holbein's painting. The detail of the face, particularly, is very powerful. The modeling, the way that it sort of sits back and it makes his head appear, is very striking indeed. And as we know, looking at lots of corridor portraits, some of them can be really awkward. They make kings and queens look like taxidermy, like stuffed animals, and not anything like the prototype in which they were based on. But the Sheldon Henry is, I think, very good. And the other details in the painting, I mentioned the sword is very fascinating because that is probably harking back to, again, ideas of depictions of justice. And that is what Holbein, it seems, was referencing in the barber surgeon painting, which I've never seen in person, but is a magnificent image of Henry holding a sword with his barber surgeons in front of him. And also, there's a tiny little detail on one of Henry's rings that you can actually see on one of his hands of a crucifix. Now, I unfortunately am not well versed enough in the world of Henry VIII to think about, and particularly Sheldon, about whether there's any link perhaps to this idea of defender of the faith associated with that too, since Sheldon was a Catholic. And obviously we know that the complexities behind the politics of all of that is really quite interesting to consider, but I wonder if there's something in that too. But most of all, of course, the costume that Henry is wearing is resplendent in detail, and only when you get up close to it, you look at the lead tin yellow that's used to pick out the details of the jewelry, of the golden cloth in his outfit, you can actually see how intricate it is. There are actually details of pentimenti, that means changes of mind, where the artist you can actually see that he's moved the jewelry around at several moments during the painting of the picture. So again, I hope that the museum, if they find the money to do it, will have the painting scanned so that we can actually understand exactly how it was made, because I think there are many more mysteries and let's say, more secrets to be learned out about how it was made. And sometimes, as we know, these are the things that really spark our imagination.
Yes, and those little details can often tell you so much as well, and can be, I mean, with Henry VIII, because he's such a recognisable figure, it's, you very quickly know that you're looking at a portrait of Henry VIII. But in lesser known figures, or where there's very scant records, tiny clues can actually be hugely important. I mean, I've written a book about the rise and fall of Margaret Pole and her family, and there's a portrait which is very likely to be Margaret Pole. I'm sure you know the one I'm speaking about. And what's great about that, well, one of the big reasons why that portrait is very likely to be her is a tiny little, I mean, firstly, it's an elderly woman, very richly apparelled. There weren't that many very richly apparelled elderly women who would have justified having a portrait. But the clue that it's her is actually, it's a tiny little thing, and she's wearing a bracelet, and hanging from the bracelet is a charm, and the charm is a barrel of wine. And Margaret Pole's father, George, Duke of Clarence, was famously executed by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. So that is possibly quite a big clue that this is indeed Margaret Pole.
Yes. Well, I mean, fascinating details. And what I often have to constantly remind, and as we do all the time, is imagine an age where images are actually incredibly rare. I mean, we're just, overwhelmed by them in our modern age. We see just images on screens just all the time. But imagine an age where you don't have many. Looking is a very important thing. Imagine going into, you probably live your life, only seeing, if you're somebody of middling rank, a few paintings in your whole entire lifetime, maybe more print material. But I think the way that they absorbed images and like you say, the details of that barrel of wine, it wouldn't have been gone amiss on these sorts of people, particularly of courtiers. And yeah, I mean, as you're right, Henry VIII is, you just have to look at it and know it is. And I suppose this is one of the reasons I think why this interesting story of mine has gone across the world, is because he is such a recognizable figure. And it's because of the likes of Holbein that he is, I suppose. But yeah, it's the details on paintings, and whether you have inscriptions, whether you have, particularly in the Elizabethan period, all these fascinating impressors, these very strange poetical symbols that relate to obviously certain conceits, let's say, endlessly fascinating, endlessly interesting. And you can spend your whole life looking through impressor books and emblemata, things, working them out. And I absolutely love trying to get you into that 16th, 17th century mindset, as much as we can, of course, without any of the syphilis and the dysentery that goes along with it.
So you mentioned that the portrait, there's lots of H's throughout, and there's knots that appear to be figures of 8. So I'm assuming, obviously, referencing that this is Henry VIII.
Yes, the costume is resplendent in details. As you say, H's in the sort of the chains, the necklaces around him. The knots are very interesting. And of course, you see them all the time, this sort of intricate knotwork on details of textiles and cloths, on bands of collars and sleeves all the time. But it's so obviously looking at the number 8, I think, in this case, that it's just, pointing out that this is Henry VIII. And isn't it even more amazing to imagine that this was a painting that was supposed to be seen at the top of a room, yet the artist still put all that detail in it that you can't really admire unless you're up close. There's also a magnificent garter sash and badge that's hanging from his sort of garter sash, I suppose, like a medallion, which is also very nice with George and the Dragon. And also one of the most exciting things about the painting, when I actually managed to see it in person finally, is that the original inscription survives on the painting, but it's been overpainted. Now, one of the mysteries...
Yes, I was going to ask about that.
It's one of the mysteries that I didn't understand until I actually saw the thing, is that all of Sheldon's paintings were all identified with gold inscriptions on them, identifying the sitters of each portrait, and the one of Henry was missing. And originally I thought, well, maybe it's because it's sort of a cramped composition. His head's quite big, and maybe, they just didn't bother doing it. But only when I got up close and used a very powerful torch can you actually see that Henry VIII, or eighth in Roman, has actually been painted out at a later period, but you can still see the remains of this gold lettering or bright yellow lettering. I hope, again, it's up to the council to do what they want with it. I hope they'll consult a conservator, and it might be even possible to reinstate that inscription, which I think will, again, be really magnificent to do if it's possible. I don't know whether the inscription was, scratched off or just overpainted by a later restorer, probably because they didn't, they wanted it against a background. Lots of restorers and later owners of pictures didn't really care what they did with paintings. They cut them down sometimes. They overpainted them. It's very often the case. But I think that was by far one of the most exciting things, actually seeing the picture in person.
I mean, as I'm sure you saw a few months ago, the very, very famous portrait of Anne of Cleves went through a huge restoration project. And I mean, the difference once it was stripped back to how it originally looked and sort of tarted up. I mean, it was a completely different portrait. It just looked incredible.
Yeah, the Louvre have done the most amazing job recently on their paintings. Yeah. I mean, the Louvre particularly has been an institution which has always shied away from cleaning any of their paintings. And actually, in a way, it's a good thing because conservators can destroy things, particularly conservators with egos. And those still exist, by the way, today. Conservators still destroy pictures by overcleaning them. But the Louvre, I think, have taken a really very clever approach, really, by being very careful, doing it in-house with only the best of the best. And the transformation of paintings like that is just unbelievable. And another really fascinating, I can't wait to see it in person, but the Catherine Parr, which is now in the NPG exhibition, of course, on Henry VIII's wives. That painting, I didn't work on it personally, but I was at Sotheby's at the time when it was being sold.
Exactly. Yes, it sold last year.
And that painting, I never forget when we first looked at it. It come from the Earl of Jersey's collection in pristine condition underneath a very yellowy brown layer of varnish that I think did no real justice to what it looks like now, because the owners have obviously, it now belongs to a private collection, but they've had it very carefully restored, the full color of that picture and the way the background looks with those blocks of color. I think to me, it looks like a modern painting. It feels like it just came from, whoever Master John was. It's like from his studio. It's brilliant. And I think, it's exciting to work at an auction house because you get to see things that come from private collections and that you send them back into the world, but very rarely actually do auction houses clean paintings. We just sort of often sell them as seen effectively. But conservation can transform the way we look at a painting. And there's so many other works of art that could have this done to them. And I think we would all look at them differently.
Absolutely. I mean, that particular portrait, I saw it at the Six Lives exhibition. It is remarkable. It's so rich in detail. I think we're very clearly seeing Catherine Parr as she appeared in life. It's an extraordinary portrait.
And I have to admit, the excitement about when it finally came onto the block last year was unbelievable. And there are some people, not us, of course, because you and I, we love this stuff, and I'm sure the people listening do. But there is some school of thought that why are we wasting time by thinking about old things, old art? What's the point of it anymore? There's some people that think that we should just be praising the likes of Elon Musk and thinking about the stars and Mars and all of that. But still, the fact that these beautiful things can command enormous, sums and are still widely admired, I think, in our day more than any other period. Particularly things like anything relating to the wives of Henry VIII. The excitement that is around those sorts of things gives me a lot of hope in the future. I don't know about you.
Oh, totally. It also tells us that there is so much out there still waiting to be discovered. I think that's the thing that's endlessly fascinating. And, also what I also love is when portraits are x-rayed and things underneath suddenly come through. I mean, I'm sure you probably know, but maybe not. There's this portrait of Elizabeth I that under x-ray a few years ago, a portrait of another woman entirely could clearly be seen underneath. And you can absolutely tell from the shape of the face, the very clear French hood, that it was Anne Boleyn underneath this portrait of Elizabeth. Why? Who knows? I'm not sure if you know the one I'm referring to. If you're not, I'll send you over a photograph of it, because it's remarkable. I mean, this clearly is Anne Boleyn underneath a portrait of Elizabeth I.
I think I know exactly the one you mean. I suppose, yes. Technology gives us this unrivaled opportunity to understand paintings, that we've never had before in the same way. X-rays, infrared, endlessly fascinating. But I think in that particular case, it's also reminding us that historically and centuries ago, they were far more pragmatic about such things than we are today. And we get very, touchy with what we do with historical objects. But imagine an age where they thought, well, this is a queen, she's gone now, nobody really wants this painting, we're just going to paint over it, because planks of oak are actually very expensive, as they were, good, solid and stable panels in which to paint. They don't go cheaply. So that idea of just painting over to a later 16th century artist thinks, well, we've got a new queen now. She's particularly, fussy about how she wants to be painted, as we hear. So let's just get on with it and paint over this one. But, lots of other artists were also very experimental, Rembrandt being one of those. He was a man who's constantly changing compositions. And we, of course, call these things pentimenti, changes of mind, this process of being an artist. Joshua Reynolds was another artist too. He's constantly fidgeting with what he does with his paintings. Some artists who didn't necessarily rely too heavily on drawings, that is, making studies and, from a drawing then going to the finished picture. But other artists were far more experimental and far more, let's say, it's gone out of my head, but experimental in their approach. Technology allows us to see this in a way that we've never been able to before.
The portrait, as you say, it's now housed in the drawing room at Warwick Old Shire Hall. Do we have any insight in how it ended up there?
Well, the curators at the museum have told me that it seems to have just been sort of hanging around lots of council offices and buildings for the past decades. And the position of the painting, as I mentioned to you, it was hanging right up, at the top of the ceiling. I had to get on a stepladder and make sure I didn't break my neck to actually see it. They use those sets of paintings just purely for decorative purposes. That's all. They, of course, were buying these paintings originally in the 1950s just for that same idea. Just, we have a big set of council offices and buildings that we need, to be filled with nice paintings to give people that sense of history. And that's the reason that they were acquired. And that's, again, why I love this story in a way, because it's actually showing that still, even in these public collections, this is a painting which presumably has been published in public catalogues for an awfully long time, but nobody's actually, it seems, gone to think about, well, how old is this painting? What is its significance? Where did it come from? And I feel very lucky that I managed to put it all together within a sort of an hour of research. And now, for some unknown reason, probably because of the cult of Henry VIII, it's gone around the world. Who would have known?
Yeah, you cracked the code. So when you approached the Warwick Old Shire Hall, did they have no sense of the provenance of this piece? Was it a complete surprise?
It was a complete surprise to them, yes. I worked very closely with a brilliant historian called Aaron Manning, who's the interpretation manager at Hampton Court and for the HRP. Shout out to Aaron. And we very kindly enough got an invitation to go and look at it. But and I understand, I think lots of people are very skeptical when you come to them with, exciting discoveries. And even up until the day of showing the BBC, the question was, well, Adam, how sure are you? And there's no doubt in my mind, all the evidence stacks up. The quality of the picture, the frame, the size of it is perfect, matches perfectly the others. The inscription, which has since been found, and the engraving, like all of these things come together. I think now the council is entirely satisfied as well. But they had no idea. All they know is that it was purchased in the 1950s from Adderley Hall, but curators at museums might not necessarily be painting specialists. It was the sheer luck of I suppose the Twitter algorithm.
Yes, hiding in plain sight, as it were. So there's also, I could tell from the photograph, there's portraits of other notable figures in that room. There's what looks to be a full-length, quite famous Margaret Tudor portrait. There's an Edward VI. Did you examine any of those other portraits whilst you were there and sort of learn anything more about those?
Yes. So the council were buying quite a few paintings in the 1950s, and you're right to point out the Margaret Tudor. That is a 17th century copy, it seems, of that famous painting. And in truth, most of them are just straightforward copies of things, and so you can understand why maybe nobody had ever had too much of an interest to look into it any further. And when you work at somewhere like Sotheby's, you get to learn how many copies of paintings are out there in the world. There are an awful lot, particularly of kings and queens. Town halls are just filled with, copies of William III and George I and George III after Reynolds. That thing is bread and butter for public buildings. There is, in fact, another exciting discovery. Vaguely discovery, I suppose, about a painting that is also hanging up so high that, again, I risked my life to go and look at it properly. But it's slightly later than the Tudor period, but I'm going to announce it at a later point, if you don't mind. But keep your eyes open. But anyway, not as exciting as Henry VIII. But again, these places were decorated in recent times just to have something on the wall, but they didn't really, I think, realize exactly what the significance of this one was.
Finally, discoveries like this, they are, as I'm sure it's for you as an art historian, these are the sort of the best parts of the job. To that end, what Tudor art discovery or missing piece would you love most?
There are so many, and again, I feel very fortunate that I've had an opportunity to work at somewhere like Sotheby's, because you get invited to do valuations for historic houses across the country, across Europe. And there are so many things waiting in private collections to see the light of day sometimes that will change our opinions about lots of different aspects of art and history. I believe, people have a right to private property, but you never know. Sometimes these paintings will come to light, be sold, be accepted by museums as part of the acceptance and lieu scheme, for example, which is a magnificent scheme that the government has to ensure that famous works of art stay in the country if they're deemed important enough to be. And as long as paintings survive, I think that's the most important thing. As long as they're not destroyed by neglect, that is significant. But if there's one painting from the Tudor period that I would like to discover more so than any other, is the missing portrait of the poet Sir Philip Sidney by Paolo Veronese. You probably know that. I'm sure you know who Philip Sidney is. He was the sort of Elizabeth I's shepherd knight, the shining, example of what a Protestant knight should be. And he died very young in 1586 at the Battle of Zutphen, fighting the Spanish. And he actually traveled on a grand tour when he was a young man, and whilst in Italy decided and had to choose between sitting to the great Jacopo Tintoretto or Paolo Veronese for a portrait. And he sat for Veronese in the end. And that surviving painting has gone missing. We don't know where it is. There was an article written about it in the 90s, sort of pointing out the various places it could have gone and what we know about its commissioning. But that painting must be spectacular. And the interesting thing is that contemporaries actually describe this painting as showing Sir Philip being rather effeminate looking, which I find fascinating. I would love to know exactly what they meant by that if we could see this painting. But also, let's not forget, compared to Elizabethan and Tudor portraits, of course, we had the likes of Holbein very briefly, but not many great European artists came to paint in this country. Zucchero did and painted those lost portraits of Dudley and Elizabeth, but I would love to see an Elizabethan painted by Veronese, and particularly Sir Philip Sidney, who is a remarkable poet and a remarkable figure in English history. That where it's gone, maybe one day it will come out of the woodwork.
That's the I suppose the eternal hope, isn't it? That these things will just crop up and do from time to time. So fingers crossed. I mean, I would love for there to be an Anne Boleyn discovery. I think there might be something on the horizon. Won't say any more, but I believe something has potentially been found. But that would be for me the one, because she's such a figure, she's such a titan of history, and the fact that we don't know really what she truly looked like is, I find, endlessly infuriating.
There are still discoveries to be made, and so my fingers crossed to all the Anne Boleyn lovers out there who are waiting, because I hope something does come up one day for you all.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to discuss your amazing discovery with us today. It's been utterly fascinating.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Adam. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we speak again sometime soon.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. My thanks again to Adam for coming onto the show to discuss his amazing portrait discovery with us. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, then perhaps you would consider becoming an official patron of the channel. Via my Patreon, I release weekly bonus podcast episodes. From as little as £5 a month, you can access all content from the Tudor Chest. Next week, I'm thrilled to be speaking with Cynthia Hand, the author behind the popular My Lady Jane book series, which has now been adapted into an utterly brilliant and bonkers television series, My Lady Jane, via Amazon Prime Studios. That will drop next Thursday. If you would like to reach out to me with any podcast suggestions, please feel free to message me on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.